There's been a lot of talk recently about tariffs and trade restrictions and a lot of things that we could generally give a name to of protectionism. A lot of different political leaders and a lot of different factions across the political spectrum in many countries have been talking about this. And this has come under titles like de-risking or decoupling, but it's also a more general concern that globalization or international trade may be harming some segments of a particular country's economy. And that may be leading to job losses, or it may be leading to depressed wages, or it could be leading to environmental problems or national security issues, or any number of other things, at least according to those who advocate for these tariffs and trade restrictions. And there's a lot of people who are vehemently opposed to these tariffs and trade restrictions. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how we explain this. Why are people suddenly so interested in restricting free trade? Now, if we think about the period from about 1930 until the 1980s, trade globally was much more restricted than we would think of as being normal today or sort of a baseline today. Right? There were very high barriers to all different kinds of trade during this period. And that was true both in wealthier economies and in much of what we could, for lack of a better term, call the developing world. Many countries there were following a policy that became known as import substitution. And import substitution meant taxing or otherwise restricting imports in order to nurture domestic industries. Now, from the 1980s, what we started to see was a new orthodoxy taking hold in at least many countries, particularly higher income countries. And that orthodoxy said that protectionism is bad and free trade is good. And that came under a kind of a general rubric that we could call, and that has been called by many people, neoliberalism. And that really came to be kind of a universally accepted doctrine by the 1990s, again, at least in most higher income countries and economies. And what that doctrine said is that restricting free trade is counterproductive. And those who advocated for tariffs or new trade restrictions were often branded as either sort of labor union radicals on the left or nationalist cranks on the right. And the idea was that free trade would lead to more efficiency, lower prices, benefits for consumers, and generally economic growth, both for one's own country and for the global economy. And to some extent, this is true. And so the arguments against protectionism are very clear. If you engage in these kinds of tariffs and trade barriers, what you'll end up doing is maintaining inefficient industries inside one's own country that will increase costs for consumers, meaning basically that tariffs are essentially a tax on your own consumers. And in addition to that, it undermines the ability of your own economy and other economies to engage in trade based on their comparative advantage. In other words, it will undercut the overall efficiency of the economy of both one's own country and the global economy. And that's not absolutely wrong, right? If you restrict trade, this will increase prices and costs. It may fuel inflation. It will lead to lower efficiency. So, why not just go for free trade? The criticism of globalization or free trade is a little bit less obvious, perhaps, in part because of that ongoing orthodoxy. And the criticism of open trade or of free trade generally as opposed to protectionism is that if you engage in free trade, you will end up importing not just lower cost products and services, but also a kind of global inequality that some people will end up doing very, very well, and others will end up doing much less well. There will be some people in industries that are ones in which your country has comparative advantage, and those industries and sectors will boom. And there will be lots of other people in sectors and industries where you do not have comparative advantage and someone else does. And a lot of those people will lose their jobs, or at least suffer depressed wages and stagnant living standards. And so we'll see sort of, certain people in the economy reap a lot of rewards, and others really bear the brunt of all of the negative sides of that. The inequality inside one's own economy will increase, and global inequality can also increase, right? Between wealthier countries and poorer countries, or countries with comparative advantage in key sectors and those without. And those costs or sort of negative effects of free trade are often underestimated or misunderstood, or are assumed to be sort of inevitable products of the advance of technology or growth in the global economy generally. And again, to some extent, that is true. But why then think about tariffs, trade restrictions, or other barriers? Well, those might slow the process down. They might actually protect some of those more vulnerable and some sectors that are more vulnerable to competition from free trade from going under, or at least going under quite so quickly, right? They might preserve some jobs, they might protect some livelihoods, and also crucial in many larger countries, especially regions. There are whole regions of most large countries that are at risk from free trade, or at least that suffer the negative consequences of it more than others, just as there are some regions that do very, very well from free trade and would suffer under a more protectionist system. So, if we think about the United States, for example, the sort of Northeast Corridor and California do very well from open trade. Some parts of the Midwest also do extremely well from free trade, and some parts of the South too, particularly those places that engage in exports of agricultural products, which do extremely well when there's open trade. But a lot of other regions, inland industrial regions, for example, in the Great Lakes, um, don't do so well as regions from open trade, at least not as uniformly, right? Because those places have high concentrations of sectors that are not going to fare well in an open trading environment. Old heavy industrial sectors, for example, in which the United States no longer really has comparative advantage, the way that it did in the 19th and early 20th centuries when those industries were established. We could see similar patterns in most European countries, for example, or indeed, as I've even written about, in China. Some parts of China do very well from free trade, others really don't, even today, let alone earlier. And that's going to be true in any country of a certain scale. And so part of the debate then around tariffs and around versus free trade can often boil down to which regions are going to be prioritized, which sectors of the economy are going to be prioritized, right? Because just as free trade tends to open up inequality between certain sectors and regions, it also can then open up inequality between those who have particular skills or resources that are demanded by the global economy, or in which one's country has comparative advantage, and those who do not have access to those skills or resources. And so, what that can often mean, again, particularly in higher income countries, is that those with high levels of education or technical expertise, or access to certain key resources or certain endowments of capital, can do extremely well from free trade, whereas those who do not have those skills or access to those resources often end up being hurt by free trade. And so again, that then would speak to, if we think about tariffs or trade restrictions, who are we trying to help? Why are we trying to help them? And what's the political balance of power inside the country that leads that discussion to be useful or important? Versus sticking with this, again, a pretty well accepted orthodoxy for 30 years that free trade is always good. Now, what about the argument that everyone is hurt by restrictions on trade because of rising prices and rising costs. That's not wrong. That is a cost that the economy would have to bear as a whole in the form of essentially a tax on consumption, which is what tariffs and trade restrictions are, if one opts for those. And so the way that this really has to be thought of, and again, whether we're talking about an argument from the left or the right, or that doesn't take a political side in terms of why we should have tariffs, what we have to think about when doing that is this is essentially a cost that we're going to impose on the whole economy in the form of higher prices and lower growth in order to protect or assist certain sectors, regions, or groups in society who we see as being more vulnerable or in need of assistance. And so it is actually a kind of redistribution from those who would do better in globalization, free trade reality, to those who would do worse. And it's paid for by this overall tax on the economy that comes through tariffs or trade restrictions. And I don't think that advocates of restrictions on trade are always fully honest about that trade off. Just as I don't think that the neoliberals and other advocates of free trade are always fully honest about the fact that not everyone wins, or certainly not everyone wins equally when we actually have a free trade world. And so that is a brief explanation of the debate around tariffs and trade restrictions versus free trade, globalization, and neoliberalism. Thank you.